course, he's already at war with us. We just don't think of it as being at war, but all the things that Russia does in the Baltic region, for example, the espionage, I'm sorry, the sabotage, the destruction of undersea cables and pipelines, the violations of airspace, the continued use of shadow fleet vessels, each of which is an environmental disaster waiting to happen. I was just in Salisbury and by the great cathedral there and was reminded of, they used a weapons grade chemical agent against Russian defectors. So, I mean, they're willing to do anything. And so far, we have not really figured out or shown the willingness to inflict real consequences on them. And they can see that. I was speaking to a Dutch friend for whom I have great respect. I said, why can't we, the West, and when I say we, I'm an American, obviously, but living here in Germany, why can't we do things to inflict consequences, such as seizing these shadow fleet vessels? Guaranteed, most of them are not properly insured, or they have 100 safety violations, or, I mean, even the EU sanctions commissioner, Mr. O'Sullivan, refers to them as end of life vessels. So why don't we just seize them? And he said, well, they're in international waters and we'd be breaking the law. I mean, okay, so you do that 3 or 4 times, though, the Russians will raise hell about it, and then you begin to disrupt their ability to export oil. Same thing, what they do out in the when they go out of the Black Sea, then they transload from these terrible vessels to more secure tankers in the Aegean, and then they head off to their eventual. We've got to stop that. And I think the alliance ought to be able to do some things, or maybe it's not NATO. Maybe it's a group of nations that that are going to suffer the consequences otherwise. So I think we could do something that would cause real problems for them. But the Russians see that so far we don't have that unifying leadership. We've got to put our pilots up as well as our air defense systems either inside Ukraine or do as much as you can from inside Polish airspace, Romanian airspace, Lithuanian airspace, um, and try to shoot down incoming Russian missiles and drones the way that we do for Israel and the way that we do over the Red Sea to protect international shipping from the Houthis. So the technology is certainly there, but you got to be prepared. If you're going to have a Royal Air Force pilot or an American pilot or a German pilot up in the sky, if they're are they going to shoot at unmanned systems or would they engage a Russian aircraft? Okay. Secondly, you have to assume that Russian air defense, whether it's in Russian controlled parts of Ukraine or inside Russia, if a radar from one of those systems locks on one of our pilots, they have to be able to shoot back immediately. So so suppression of enemy air defense, and then you have to assume that at some point um, one of our aircraft will be hit, and a pilot will eject, and they'll float to the ground and perhaps land inside Russian-controlled territory or in Russia. Are we prepared to go in and get them? So these are the kind of details that are really important if we want to have an effective sky shield of some sort that's integrated into what the Ukrainians are doing. It's more than just giving them more Patriot. Uh, People still look at what happens in the Baltic Sea, for example, these attacks on infrastructure or the constant airspace violations or Russian missiles and drones landing inside Poland and Romania and Latvia. It happens so much that these are not one-off incidents or accidents. Trump may not be a Russian asset in the traditional sense. The effect of him as an asset is there in those things you just discussed. The and I think the Ukrainians have realized this now for some time. And I also think this is why the European leaders joined President Zelensky at the White House back a couple of weeks ago, because they absolutely do not trust President Trump. And they were there, I think, actually to protect Zelensky as much as possible and to send a message that Europe, as imperfect as it is so far, is coming together. That the Chinese watch and they see that the Trump administration appears to be pretty flexible on this sovereignty thing, and that they may feel emboldened, and then they see a divided United States that is no longer has allies because of how we've treated our allies. When you add together the collective industries and technological advantages, the populations, the economic wealth, and nuclear weapons, if collectively that dwarfs Russia. And of course, when I speak of Europe in this context, I'm not talking about the EU. I'm talking about all of Europe, including UK and also Canada. His failure to support Ukraine and to even call Russia the aggressor is number one, increasing the chances that Ukraine eventually fails, unless Europe really can fill that gap. And therefore, Russia, within a couple of years, feels emboldened to take on a NATO by attacking a NATO country such as Latvia, because they believe that the United States is not really committed or caring. I do believe you've put your finger on something that in the past, Russia's part of its strength was its vastness. I mean, they could, every czar and even Stalin could absorb invaders, just keep going back and then attack. That now, because of Ukraine's development of long-range precision strike capabilities, uh, is a vulnerability because Russia clearly cannot protect. There's not enough air defense on the planet to protect every refinery, every pumping station, every part of that oil and gas infrastructure. And that is the oxygen for the Kremlin, is the resources that they generate with their export of oil and gas. And so if we're not going to do the job by stopping them intercepting all of these shadow fleet vessels, if we're not going to do it by putting enough pressure on China and India and even Turkey, countries that are buying the Russian oil and gas, then the Ukrainians are going to do it. The sad irony of this is that the administration could have gotten everything they wanted from Greenland if they'd have gone about it in a normal way. I mean, Denmark and Greenland have always wanted more investment there. They'd love to have a much bigger U.S. military presence. So it's the idea that somehow we have to go in there and do something is ridiculous. But the way that the world's greatest deal maker, has gone about doing it has had the opposite effect. Now, millions of people around the world know where Greenland is, understand the connection between Greenland and Denmark when they never did before because of these idiots. And I think that it also shows to me, in addition to all the obvious negative things, it's revealed the absolute lack of quality strategic thinking, and also the fact that the lack of competence in what they try to do. Friends and family here that talk, it's eerily about what their grandparents went through and did and said. And of course, the German education system is devoted to making sure that every German kid grows up knowing every single detail of what happened in the 1930s. And so they're horrified. I mean, it's like everything they ever heard that happened leading up to that, they see it happening in America. And the vast majority of Germans, even if their favorite sport is not football, but criticizing American policy, they still have always admired the United States. And they saw the US as the ideal of what could be if you had the opportunity. They never thought the US was perfect, but they saw the ideal. And I have had so many Germans tell me they can't believe what's happened to the checks and balances, or what the hell is going on with the Supreme Court. I mean, they're very knowledgeable about the American Constitution and our system, and they are just dumbfounded that things that they learned were so bad from their parents and grandparents and their education system that they see it happening in the United States today. So I think anybody that's kind of like, "Ah, come on, you're overreacting," is absolutely not paying attention.
We'll take a short break from the story to dive into the burning question of how we consume media and act on that information. Let's face it, our media is in crisis and people's attitude towards media sources as well. For me, ground news is an essential tool for us to take back control of the media we consume and rebuild our personal agency over that information. Let's take a specific story, for example, one that's breaking, but one which some outlets have chosen not to feature. But with ground news, we can find enough sources to get a strong overview of the story as well as a wealth of detail. Ground news will show you the biased distribution of coverage. In this instance, the story is covered by more right leaning publications than left or centre. Some outlets both side the issue, suggesting Ukraine thinks that this is an unacceptable offer. Some go further and explain why it is unrealistic and disingenuous. Well, you can't fix the bias and framing of individual media sources, but you can immediately see all the ways in which the story is framed, get a fuller picture, and come to your own balanced conclusions. You can dig further to understand how media ownership may influence the framing of the story. And you can also click through to related topics for ease of browsing or research. Ground News does not eliminate bias, but presents you with the entire landscape of media coverage of a story. It allows you to spot the biases in headlines and then the detail of content. It's a far better way to detect bias in news sources and develop the analytical skills to navigate the news on your own terms. This is, of course, super relevant to me as I draft news bite scripts daily, sifting through hundreds of media sources and stories to try and craft truthful, detailed, and impactful stories. Ground News has become an essential tool in my interaction with media and research workflow. Ground News delivers all the benefits I'm looking for in a news aggregation tool. It helps with information overload. It ensures that sensationalism does not win out over facts and detail, and it can help neutralize the impact of manipulative algorithms. Ground News is an essential tool to relearn how to trust information sources. More than that, trust yourself to curate news content, get value from it, but also to be analytical and critical. Subscribe to get 40% off the Vantage link by scanning the QR code on the screen or using the Silicon Curtain specific link, which is ground.news/silicon. This can also be found in the video description and the pinned comment. When you subscribe, you'll get access to both the website and the app.
I am glad to hear, I'm heartened to hear that there was pushback inside the Department of Defense against something like that. Hopefully, hopefully, you've got a lot of retired senior officers that are letting it be known through whatever means that this is unacceptable. These kinds of things that they're doing, the misuse of the military, the expectation that the military will perform tasks that are unconstitutional or certainly borderline illegal. I wouldn't expect to see uniformed officers publicly going out and saying this is wrong or whatever. Their job is unless it's illegal, they have to do that. But trying to prevent the administration from doing things that would be unconstitutional or illegal uh, is their responsibility. I think, I've thought for a while now about President Trump. Why is he so seemingly either pro-Putin or he wants to be like him or he wants to be admired by Putin? He's envious of the authority that Putin and Xi and Kim Jong-un seem to wield, by the way. All the trappings of that. I mean, when you look at what he's done to the Oval Office, and I even now see American soldiers in the White House and Marines doing things that I used to only see happening, like when Putin would walk it down through the doors and you'd have the two Russian guards there with their noses way up in the air. I now see American troops having to do this. And so he clearly is wanting to copy or imitate that. I think it's been clear for some time that the Kremlin has zero respect for us collectively, and in particular for the Trump administration. This meeting in Alaska, then the meeting of all the European leaders with Trump and Zelensky and the White House, and then immediately after that, increase in the number of drone strikes against Ukrainian citizens. No, I don't see that happening. And of course, if they're successful in undermining midterm elections and other things, a lot of people are already starting to realize that Trump's goal is not to leave office at the end of his term, but to, through a variety of manufactured crises, remain in power. When I look at the industry, the economy, the wealth, the populations, all the things that Europe has in total, but it's not acting collectively. It's very frustrating because you should be able to, Europe by itself should be able to shut down Russia. Yeah, of course you don't have 10,000 nuclear weapons, but you don't need 10,000 nuclear weapons. What you need is the ability to shut down Russia's ability to generate resources to keep the war going and to keep the oligarchs in power. And they're the ones that keep Putin in power. I don't see anything happening with this administration over the next 3 years that makes me think, they're finally going to get it and then they'll be back and we'll get this all sorted. When I heard President Trump yelling at President Zelensky there in the Oval Office, one of the worst days of my life watching that. And he said, "You got no cards," meaning, there's no way you can win against Russia because it's so big and it's so much better. And of course, President Trump's understanding and grasp of history is pretty mangled, and his geography is pretty weak. But also, him and other people around him don't understand why people fight. I mean, you could say that the colonials didn't have the cards when we rebelled against Great Britain. Or you could say that the Taliban did not have the cards when they defeated us in Afghanistan, or the Viet Cong didn't have any cards when they defeated us in Viet, and on and on and on and on. Why do people fight? And the Ukrainians are fighting for their survival. And he doesn't get that. And that is compounded with the fact that because he would have never done it himself, by the way. I mean, his own personal avoidance of the draft is pretty well known. But that combined with what you've described so well as this perception, and unfortunately, there's a lot of the so-called Russia experts in Washington, as well as here in Germany, that absolutely believe that, like, come on, there's just no way. Going back to the famous speech in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, where he kind of and so many Germans where I live, they always refer to that speech like, wow, we should have been listening to the warning coming from Vladimir Putin. But people like you were listening to it, fortunately. Um, I think that the idea for Russia, the strategic objective is first and foremost to make sure that Ukraine does not survive as a sovereign state for a variety of reasons, not only because he can't bear the idea of a prosperous, liberal, free, capitalistic, democratic Ukraine right on his border, where Ukrainians have a higher standard of living than do Russians. And I think there are some aspirations to regain what he sees as rightfully Moscow's, such as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Georgia. But Ukraine, of course, is the big prize. He believes that they're going to win until, as long as he thinks the United States and Europe will not do what's necessary to help Ukraine. So because the U.S. has turned its back on Ukraine, or President Trump seems waffly about does he really want to support Ukraine against Russia, and because most European countries seem to be still don't have the sense of urgency about helping Ukraine stand fast the 5% agreement. I think Putin sees all that as weakness. And clearly, the fact that his army has suffered over 1 million casualties, that's not going to be what drives Russia out of the war. I think as long as he is able to continue exporting oil and gas to China and India, and he gets revenues for that, and until he gets real domestic pressure, which seems unlikely, I think he's content to keep doing what he's doing. The price of oil um, is one of the main considerations for the Trump administration because obviously, he campaigned on lowering gas prices. He campaigned on getting interest or inflation down. And so anything that raises the prices, um, that's going to factor into what he wants to do. Um, Otherwise, I think it's such an obvious bit of leverage for the West to shut down these shadow fleet vessels that pass through the Baltic Sea, which is totally controlled by NATO countries and EU countries, and then the Black Sea, which Turkey, of course, controls the straits, and they're unlikely to do something direct against Russia. But I don't know that we've really tried to make that because the Turks don't trust that we would back them up. So it's a real vulnerability. So I can only imagine that we haven't done this is because like sometimes with sanctions, you know, you suffer also that there would be an impact on us or on China. And so none of these things are not happening in a vacuum. Impact on China and on India is not inconsequential. And about 70% of what Russia exports goes to China and India. So I don't mean to be too simplistic or dismissive of those concerns, but this goes back to what has been our problem all along, is that we never said our strategic objective is to help Ukraine defeat Russia, get them back to the 91. So because we never clearly identified a strategic objective, we've not been very good at identifying the policies that would help us achieve that objective. Was very important because it did, as you say, remove a big chunk of their ability to launch cruise missiles against Ukrainian cities that were delivered by bombers. And of course, these are aircraft that cannot be replaced, not anytime soon because they don't make them anymore. And I don't know the full extent of damage of the ones that were only damaged, not destroyed, but where are the repair parts coming from that would to make them whole again? So I suspect that the impact is even more significant than we might know. But that's only a part of it. The other part is now um, Russian leadership, at least, can see that every square kilometer of Russia can be touched, either by some sort of unmanned system or sabotage or special operators or the GUR. Somebody can get everywhere. And that's got to be really psychologically difficult for the Russians since they have always been able to rely on the vastness of Russia as part of their overall defense. If they could just absorb invading armies until they can destroy them. So this will have to change their mindset. And then finally, I imagine that there is a lot of um, uncertainty. I mean, how could the GUR penetrate Russia so effectively? How have they been able to get through and deep into Russia and do these things? So if that creates a lot of distrust in a society, which I think already is loaded with distrust, a kind of chaos, that can only be helpful for Ukraine. When I was at the Chalk History Festival this past weekend, this was one of the things we discussed of how, when people say, oh, we can't produce enough, Russia's producing so much more that we in Europe can't do it, that's only because we haven't tried. I mean, when you add together the economies and industries, defense industries of all of the nations of the EU, plus UK, plus Norway, plus Canada, forget the US, it dwarfs Russia. So why are we having a problem? And it's because we haven't gotten into this mindset that we have to help Ukraine win. It's for our benefit here in Europe. We haven't made the necessary changes to the law in the different countries to enable faster growth. And in 1942, after the Arcadia Conference, when Churchill and Roosevelt agreed it was strategically the priority to defeat Nazi Germany first, even though it was Japan that had attacked the United States. And when at a time when no Americans wanted to get in a land war in Europe again, they still agreed Germany first. And so from the beginning of 1942 and 33, 44, in less than 3 years, we went from being the number 17 army in the world right behind Bulgaria to having 12 million women and men in uniform and tens of thousands of tanks and bombers and dozens and dozens and dozens of aircraft carriers in less than 3 or 4 years. So it really, what we lack is not industrial capacity or potential. It's the self-confidence and the determination that this is what is the priority, and civilian leaders that are willing to explain that to us, why you have to do it. So, if we wanted to, Russia would have been knocked out of this a couple of years ago, but we haven't demonstrated the political will to do that.